ma kotana na panaya ito kelamahana ma kotana na panaya ito kelamahana ma kotana na panaya ito kelamahana.
The Indians of California used the bow and arrow to hunt game for food and clothing. The Yokut Indians made a strong bow from elderberry wood. The arrow maker preferred obsidian, a black volcanic glass, for making arrow points. A point was made from a flake that was broken from a large piece of obsidian. The flake was held in a piece of buckskin to protect the worker's hand as he roughly shaped the point by chipping around the edges. The finer shaping was done with the tip of a deer antler. Pressure was used rather than blows to force off small chips from the underside of the point. Controlling the pressure of the antler tip to form a good arrow point required skill and practice. The finished point was evenly shaped with a notched base and a sharp edge. California Indians made most of their arrows in two sections, a long main shaft and a short foreshaft, on which the point was fastened. Deer sinew was chewed to make it soft and used to bind the arrow point to the shaft. When the sinew dried, it was trimmed and coated with a waterproof layer of pitch or asphaltum. The arrow maker used a hot stone tool to straighten the long main shaft. Sliding the shaft through the groove of the arrow straightener hardened and polished the wood. The heated shaft was carefully worked until it was straight. Feathers were split in half and placed on one end of the long main shaft to make it fly straight. The feathers were fastened to the shaft with sinew. The Yokut Indians preferred feathers from the red-tailed hawk for their arrow shafts and bound them in a spiral position for more accurate shooting at long range. A socket was made at the other end of the main shaft and bound with sinew. The socket held the foreshaft. With a good main shaft and a variety of special pointed foreshafts, a hunter was equipped to shoot rabbits, birds, or deer. The foreshafts were carried in a small skin bag, and the long arrow shafts in a skin quiver. The bow and arrow was the most important hunting tool used by the California Indians. Hunters followed age-old traditions and customs as they searched for game. When hunting for deer, the hunters of many tribes imitated the actions and sounds of the animal. young boys were trained by their fathers in the art of stalking game, for it required great skill to approach a timid deer. A boy was proud when he was permitted to wear the stuffed headdress of the hunting costume. Closer and closer the hunter moved as he patiently stalked the deer. Anticipating a successful hunt, he pulled an arrow shaft from his quiver, a foreshaft from his belt, and put them together. The hunter used all his skill to move as close as possible to the cautious animal. When he could move no closer, the hunter sent his arrow on its way. A deer was used in many ways. No part of it was wasted. The skin was tanned for clothing, tools were made from the bones and antlers, and sinew was needed for bow and arrow making. Some of the fresh meat was roasted over family fires, and some was dried for future use. The strips of meat were hung in the sun each day until they were dry enough for storage. Native plants furnished an important part of the Indians' food supply. The daily life of the women was largely devoted to gathering the natural food crops of seeds, berries, nuts, and roots, and preparing them for use. Acorns were the staff of life for nearly all the tribes. When the acorns dropped from the oak trees in the fall, burden baskets were filled to the brim and carried back to the village. Women trudged many miles to gather the year's supply of this staple food. The Yokuts filled many of their storage granaries with the large acorns of the valley oak. When acorns were needed, the ribs of the granary were spread apart to make an opening. Many hours were spent preparing the acorns for eating. They were hulled by cracking the outer shell and removing the kernel. The acorn kernels were then pounded to a fine meal. A favorite working place was a granite boulder where the women of the village gathered to pound acorns. The rhythm of the pounding stones blended with the songs of the women as they worked. The mortar holes in the great boulder were deepened as generation after generation prepared their daily food. The acorn meal was removed from the mortar hole and placed on a sifting tray. By tapping and shaking the sifting tray, the coarse meal was separated and rolled back into the mortar. The fine meal was held by the coils of the tray and collected in another basket. The bitter taste of the acorn meal was washed away with water. A hole was made in a mound of sand and lined with leaves. Over the leaves, a layer of acorn meal was spread. water was heated with hot stones. They were dipped to clean off the ashes and dropped in the basket of water. The hot stones were stirred around and around to keep them from burning the basket. The meal was covered with a grass brush to keep it from washing away when the hot water was poured over it. As the water drained through the meal into the sand, it leached the bitter tannin from the acorn meal. The meal was tasted after each washing, and the leaching process was repeated until the meal was sweet enough to satisfy the worker. When the water had drained away, the leached acorn meal was ready to be eaten. Sometimes it was cooked to make mush, or dried and eaten raw. Sometimes small cakes were formed and baked on hot stones close to the fire. Each family had its own cooking fire where meals were prepared. Meat was placed on a green stick and roasted over the flames. Mush was made from acorns, dried berries, and many kinds of seeds. The Yokut used a looped stick to stir the hot cooking stones through the mush and to lift them from the cooking basket. At mealtime, family groups gathered together and companionship was shared as they served themselves from the cooking basket.
Hermaien samen hun kinderen. En verschijt.
Helemaal hoi.
Hermaien samen hun kinderen. En verschijt.
In the early evening, there was time for storytelling. These people had no written language, and their history and customs were preserved in the legends passed on to each new generation. Today, the old villages have disappeared, but the history of these native Californians still lives in the stories handed down from long ago.
Maar te tragen hin, maar jou nog zitten. Hou ik om een nog zit in de kantje. Zo dat lumpen haar goed hoor. Want een nog zitten jou. Maar we tragen te hand maar jou naar ten tappen hin. En ik om ik ten hin want je dat tappen.